Welcome to the Second Bite podcast, where we talk with top entrepreneurs and CEOs about creating valuable companies through creative transactions. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hey, and so welcome back. This is the Second Bite podcast. Happy to have you. I have Ben Edson with me, founder and CEO of VariQ. Ben, super happy to have you with us today.
Thanks, Todd.
Hey, and Ben, just before I get started, this is going to be a really good episode because you and I met when you acquired one of my clients. So you're a buyer. And then it wasn't all that long after that the company you've spent almost 20 years building, you sold. And so I want to delve into a couple of different things. It's always great when we've got somebody that can balance the fact that they were a buyer and that they were a seller, because I think it adds a really interesting perspective. I want to first thank the good folks at Trivest. I don't know if you're familiar with them, Ben. They're a private equity group in Miami. Been around for 30 years. They're always on the list of best founder-friendly private equity groups. They've literally done over 300 transactions. The cool thing about them is they've got a very standard fund if you're above 5 million of EBITDA, but they've got a non-control fund for guys that want to maintain control of their business but take money off the table. And they also have a fund for companies with $1 million of EBITDA or more that want to be a platform. And they're really good about building businesses. They've been in it for a long, long time. You can learn more about them at trivest.com. You can go to trivest.com/secondbite. And they got a bunch of tools and resources for listeners of the podcast. And just a really good group. I've interacted with them for a long time and really like it. So with that business out of the way, Ben, again, I'm super happy that you'll spend a little bit of time with us. As we jump in, start by telling a little bit of who is VariQ, what do you do, and give me an idea of the customers you serve and maybe the approximate size of the business.
Yeah, so thanks, Todd. So VariQ is... I started VariQ back in 2003, end of 2003. And I actually just finished a close with Cell in November 2021, right? So almost 8 years as the founder CEO. Started as just a contract of my own, working at the U.S. Senate. I was in cybersecurity, having come out of Symantec Professional Services, where I did essentially design installations of cybersecurity tools throughout the U.S. So at the Senate, I landed as a cybersecurity engineer. I deployed their first endpoint security across the entire Senate, which was 100 Senate offices and 37 committees, all through voluntary adoption. So I was a very successful politician inside of the Senate. I didn't know it at the time. To me, it was just another IT project, right?
And you may have been the last successful person being productive inside the Senate, but we'll leave that for another day.
There's a lot of great people there, but I don't think they did what I was able to do. Just knock on doors, try to solve problems and have a good idea that scales and that creates benefit back to the organization, right? So that's kind of the nexus of VariQ. Scaling up, it took me about 5 years working there myself as an engineer until I started getting itchy feet and wanting to do more, right? So within VariQ, I then added a second employee, then a third employee, then figured out how to do subcontracting within the government space, which I didn't know how to do before. Eventually learned how to do proposals, prime work, which is putting in direct contracts into the government, adding past performance, and VariQ grew to about 50 million.
50 million in revenue.
50 million in revenue. Really pretty good margins. The three core focus areas that VariQ specialized in was cybersecurity, which came from my background. And then we got into a lot of software development and DevOps. So taking applications, modernizing those applications, moving those applications into the cloud. And so that was the second pillar. Then the third pillar was cloud and enterprise IT, right? Solving problems. People still need help desk services, business support services. So VariQ had those three core areas. Some of our customers included the Homeland Security, IRS, Security and Exchange Commission, FBI, CIA. So quite a few civilian and national security customers that needed a different level of problem solving. That enabled us to then win some of the larger, what they call GWACs within government services, best in class contract vehicles. Some of those were unrestricted in nature, which means there weren't limitations on small business. That allowed us to then pivot and create a lot of value when we actually sold. The transition, though, from small business to unrestricted business was a bit of a challenge in that we had to convert out of small business. That's when we did an acquisition, and ultimately we were successful in that conversion, and also created a sale. So those two years were quite a bit of work. Throw in on top of that COVID at the beginning of 2020. So we had a purchase, our first acquisition with Todd, with you, that closed in June of 2020. And then November last year, or 2021, we sold to a strategic, right? A strategic is Capgemini is the acquirer, a Fortune 100 company, global. So quite a journey in a very compressed amount of time.
Yeah, so there's some really great stuff to unpack there. So I'll take a shot at doing that. So I remember in the spring of 20, I saw on LinkedIn that you had won a big contract. And you and I had known each other from around and meeting each other over the years. And so I sent you a note and said, "Hey, Ben, congratulations." And you said, "Todd, thanks, but I'm looking for capability, this, and this, but not in government contracting. I want to be outside. I want to be in the commercial space." Not many government contractors want to do that. They kind of stay focused on what they know, what they're good at. So tell me a little bit about the thought process before I had reached out to you. What made you want to get onto the commercial side and away from the government side?
So there's two components to that. One was some of our customers, we had actually lost some contracts to outsiders, right? Outsiders are the non-traditional government contractors that bring in commercial practices into government. And there was one particular contract where a government representative said, no, we're so good that we don't compete against government. We only compete our services to commercial companies because they're better. So I'm like, why? So is that perception or reality? And so part of it was, I want commercial practices because our customers inside of the government are looking for those practices, right? So it wasn't so much to get out of government services. It was to bring in experiences that our government customers would also embrace because they supposedly were from the commercial world, right? Government loves actually Silicon Valley stories. They love innovation. They want to change the world. And they believe that commercial companies have some of those best practices. So part of it was that, right? How do we create some additional secret, sexy sauce by bringing in a story to our own customers that was considered to be commercial? The second one, and see if that resonates within our proposals and helps us go win work. The second one was we were lacking a little bit of capability in the front-end UI UX digital experience, government coming out of COVID, and even prior to that, the areas converting from on-prem applications to in the cloud applications, and then you take in the cloud applications, you need a very sophisticated, sexy front end that then could be attractive to consumers, right, or constituents. So we didn't have that. We had a lot of, so part of the acquisition, which was Rivet Logic, was bringing on that digital experience. That was their expertise. They had customers such as TripAdvisor, Marriott International. They ran some of the websites for these customers, and that was something that we needed because we didn't have it. The other piece was, as a government contractor, there was a lot of our work was in the small business world, right? Where there's set asides and you could work really well. You could build a very good business in the small business world. But then once you become large, which is over 30 million, you're considered unrestricted. And the government says, oh, thank you for supporting us for 5 years, 10 years. We're going to give it back to the next small business. Good luck. So that transition is difficult, and in the commercial world, they don't have those restrictions, right? It's more relationship based, and so you're hunting for your work every quarter, every year. So and there's no restrictions in terms of small business, large business. So part of the portfolio that we inherited was also considered unrestricted revenue, right? So it diversified our revenue stream in a way that that was meaningful, but also brought us capability. So
Yeah,
that was a combination.
yeah, and I also remember that you felt pretty strongly that you could not build a commercial practice because of how different it is to win, the guys at Rivet. And by the way, Rivet Logic, I interviewed Mike on a podcast several months ago. But for anybody listening, you can go in the search on the podcast and just look for Rivet Logic. But they would profitably win $50,000 and $100,000 projects, and you could never. It might cost you that much money to bid on a big contract. So I think there was. Remember, one thing, you wanted the expertise on how to turn those opportunities profitably, and then potentially be able to grow and nurture those. Was that an important decision part?
It was, and it wasn't. It was more intellectual curiosity than a a business area that we wanted to really maximize on, right? The beauty of government is that you win $1 million plus contracts. It creates a lot of stability for then additional expansion and growth. The 100 to 500 to $200 tasks, you just have to be really good at repeating what you're good at. And then you also have to be good at sourcing and lining those projects up, right? So Rivet had an experience of doing that, and they had a business rhythm that I did not want to train our folks in because it's just slightly different. So we kept Rivet and their business engine somewhat independent, and than ours, right? Obviously, we had a very short run because we bought in June, and then VariQ actually sold in November of last year. So but there's new contracts that Rivet won under Rivet VariQ Rivet, and then there's also some cross relationships that we were able to bring in that benefited the Rivet team. So all good.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that. But one question that jumped to mind first is, when you did the transaction and you sold VariQ, we can talk about that a little bit later. When you did that transaction, how did they view the fact that you had just a few months earlier done an acquisition of your own? Was their approach that, hey, we're only going to pay you what you paid for it? Did they agree that it adds a nice dimension? How do they think about that?
So the one word is messy. it was it. I think it complicated the overall sale of VariQ in that buyers wanted to understand how the integration and the story fit together, right? So when VariQ went on the market, we went through a process. Um, there were about 18 companies invited to look at our books and our story, and we were very successful in how many LOIs we received. So we received about 8 LOIs.
Wow.
During the management meetings, which 18 companies, you have lots of management meetings to kind of pitch your story, your financials, your capabilities, all of those elements, similar to what Rivet did to us.
Right.
The buyers looked at it differently, right? So some buyers that had just government contract, they were looking for a particular, to them it was off-putting, right? They didn't want any commercial work. It didn't fit within the profile that they wanted. Other buyers were a little bit, they looked at Rivet as more of a capability, and to them it didn't. And then there was a third buyer that actually looked them as quite value add, because that organization had both a, a business that was focused on government services and separate businesses that were focused on commercial. Ultimately, under the Capgemini umbrella, it I don't know how they priced different pieces. Because that wasn't shared by anyone.
Right.
None of the buyers told you or told us how they valued the company. They don't break it apart, or they didn't break it apart for us. So that part is a little bit unknown. But the ones that had businesses and understood how to maximize different components of VariQ and its subsidiaries called Rivet Logic, and so, they're the ones that actually were slightly more sophisticated, because they knew how to maximize those various pieces.
Yeah, and so obviously Capgemini was one of the 8 that gave you an LOI that really valued that piece, probably for the same logical reasons that you valued it, right? Just a similarity in worldview.
Correct.
Got it. So do you remember to get into some of the granular stuff, because I think it's helpful. Many of the folks that listen to the podcast are smaller business sellers or will be sellers. Was there anything particular about Rivet that you remember early on that really drew you to them, or that you liked about them, or anything you remember that was a little bit off-putting that had to be a hurdle to get over? Do you remember any of that?
So there's a couple things that were definitely pluses, and there was a couple things that were negative. I'll start with the pieces that were positives. The positives were, one, they had a capability that we didn't have that we were looking for, right? So they had a team of talented developers, UI, UX engineers. They had marquee logos in terms of their client set. They had a trending history of growth within, and in hindsight, I discounted the effects of COVID, right? So in hindsight, I didn't quite understand how long COVID would linger within a particular market. None of us knew those things, right? So we jumped in as if COVID would disappear, which it didn't. It's still here today.
Yeah, let's hope that it will.
Yeah, and but it will at some point, right? But the capabilities were primarily number one. Number two was the amount of the transaction was something that I felt we can digest. for our size, given that that was also our first transaction, and their EBITDA numbers were healthy, right? So we bought them at about 5.5 times EBITDA, and which for a, a commercial company, I think that was good. And then there was a little bit of a kicker if they realized some of their revenue projections, right? So an earnout, call it an earnout. The pieces that were negatives within the commercial book of business, the backlog was unpredictable, right? So the way that the commercial business operated, it had a forecast of 3 to 6 months. That is very different than GovCon. GovCon, we enjoy 1 to 5 year contracts, sometimes 10-year contracts. So your backlog can be more predictable, and so that how do you value a recurring revenue engine that that has 3 months of visibility or 6 months of visibility? That's the part that we had to a little bit rely on professionals, so Todd
Yeah.
and others that kind of helped us understand how commercial is the valuation of commercial operated. So that was, I think, in general, a little bit of a negative, not having enough of that backlog, where it requires a little bit more either expertise or faith, right? in our or a combination of the two, right? But that unknown, I think, contributes to some of the valuations that that existed within that business.
And I always find that interesting because if you were not a government contractor, most of the transactions we do are with folks that are not government contractors. And they would say to you, geez, Ben, that's just the way the world is, man. There's no such thing as 3-year contracts or 2-year contracts. So you're right. And I know for a lot of listeners, you're like, man, we should get in the government space. It's not as easy as it sounds like it is, right? There's a lot of challenges like there is in any business. So as you look back now, is there a piece of advice that you would give to a seller just in the way that they approach, whether it's out of the blue or through an introduction like somebody like me or any of those things? Any insights that you would offer now that you've kind of been an acquirer and a seller?
Yeah, so I think the most important things for a seller is knowing what you want to do and what your team wants to do once the sale is finished, right? Is that the end of a chapter in a journey and you want to like walk away, or that's the beginning of your next chapter and you want to buy into something that is just maybe a little bit bigger or has some capabilities that you never had, because with those combined capabilities, you can now really accelerate what it was that you couldn't do as yourself, right? So that's kind of the process that I've gone through myself, which was, as a founder, there is just learning, not knowing anything, and for the first time, experiencing the sales cycle, the operation cycle, and then you finally realize that to really scale, you need something else, right? So for me, it was to scale, we needed to gain additional capabilities, and we either organically build them, and that became tough because we had turnover in some staff. So we acquired that capability. And then the second piece was the sell part, right? I never actually wanted to sell. I had created VariQ, or I had formed VariQ and loved the business of growing VariQ, but then opportunity kept knocking. So that emotional transition of being in the frame of mind to where selling was actually a great outcome, both for me, the employees, and our customers. That took some time, right? And that took a little bit of time. I think COVID helped because because COVID made me as a CEO look at things very differently. And just, I like people. If people are going to be remote workers, then you really need a combination of a company plus a customer set that is almost on automatic. If working collaboratively together creates a lot of energy, then that was the type of company that I really enjoyed running. So that realization that having a company and running the company purely to have a business, that wasn't enough, right? There has to be something in addition to that, or else there's just a lot of value that can be maximized in a different way. So if it makes any sense, I realized that selling was actually a better way of maximizing value, both for VariQ, so I could continue to scale, take advantage of the capabilities, the customers. But that wasn't originally what I actually wanted.
So that's interesting, Ben. If we can dig in there for just a couple minutes. So there's a lot of guys that I talk to that sometimes I'm the one that knocks on the door and says, "Hey, have you ever thought about this?" But there's also buyers that knock on the door. And I'd be interested to hear if you can articulate it, what the evolution has been for you. I just did a podcast with Wesley Matthews. He sold a company called Higher Level Market, and he shared that he had known he was not a good CEO about where they were. He didn't like it, right? His strengths were in other areas of the company, and he was aware to the fact that these are the things that I would see in a CEO if we ever brought one in or merged with one or something. And when we had introduced him to Bell Media, he's like, "Geez, that's my guy." So for him, he was aware of his weaknesses and said, "That's it," right? You've grown a $50 million business, and you love the business, and it's been good to you. What would you say to somebody when those knocks continue to come, as it relates to, yeah, you should listen to them because it helps gain clarity whether you sell or not, or do they just stay focused if they don't want to sell until they're willing to consider it?
Yeah, so I will say that M&A as an exercise is extremely distracting from running a business, right? So since the time VariQ was $1 million in revenue, there was always somebody that wanted to buy it.
Interesting.
Always. So there was every year, "Hey, do you want to sell? Hey, do you want money? Hey, do you want to do this?" Hey, there's the industry is full of bankers, M&A people, and they're always pitching something, right? The deal making. America is the land of deal making.
And also, Ben, it can fuel the ego a bit, right? To almost illusion of value.
It can. So from a core perspective, I never had an interest in selling, right? So I also didn't really have an interest in taking chips off the table and minimizing risk, any of those things. Partly because that was just in my nature. Two, because I'm very hands-on, and three, because of age, right? So I think as a young entrepreneur, and I started VariQ when I was 28. For me, you embrace risk in a different way than maybe when you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s. So life has a way of giving you emotional changes that creates different types of meaning. So starting a company when you're 28, what are my risks? Pretty much none.
Yeah, right.
Do you care so much about money? Not really, right? There's hopefully 80 years or 70 years or 60 years of being able to have success and failure. As you start moving up that stack of time, then you start thinking about, hey, what about a nest egg? What about retirement? What about taking some trips off the table? So those are things, that I, from a timing perspective, was good. The other part is the market, right? The market in 2020, 2019, 2021, there's a lot of liquidity in the market. Valuations are healthy. Cost of capital is very low. The tax and ecosystem and environment is very favorable. So there's an alignment of opportunism that says it's not a bad time to maximize success in some particular way. And so those are things, and then also the challenges of managing people, the transactional cost of folks working from home, where it's less cultural, right? People get to work from home today in a way where it's a job versus being bought into a cultural experience. Working in the office, collaborating, throwing things up on the wall, having a beer right afterwards. That is missing out of the 2020 and 21 experience. It's just different. So there's a combination of things that created you could say, an alignment of the stars for for doing something. And so those are things. Catching that moment is something that didn't quite come together before, wasn't there either because I didn't need it to be there, or it just wasn't an interest.
Do you think all those past conversations that you had, whether distracting or not, over the years, gave you a perspective to be able to judge this moment in time better than if you had not done that?
I think so. So the educational process of being aware of what is an M&A transaction, what are the valuations, am I special, or am I in a category that is not as special, and therefore I should have realistic expectations, right? Those things as a CEO and an owner, they're incredibly important. Emotionally, there's always, hey, we're doing super well. Let's not sell because
Next year
we're on
will
a
be
rocket
better.
ship and we're just going to miss out on something that'll be better tomorrow, right? The opposite is true. Hey, we were over here. Now we're on our way down. Oh, shit, we better jump out and catch some of that benefit before we have nothing, right? So there's a lot of there's an emotional roller coaster. And what's interesting is as you educate, as you get conversations, as folks tell you about their experiences, maybe there's a little bit of self-awareness that starts to trickle into the thought of, am I truly amazingly special and I'm going to last forever? Or am I at the peak of what was important? The passion might not be there anymore, and a change will be very valuable. So all of those things are, I think, important. The fear of missing out, I didn't care so much for the fear of missing out, right? That part I never really had. Oh, I'm doing great. I want to capture something before I don't have anything. But I do talk to various CEOs where they want to cash out before
It all tumbles down.
The risk of being left with less or nothing is a very real risk. And I think that takes an emotional toll on a lot of CEOs. And it's easy to want to maintain or continue when everything is going well. When things aren't going so well, that's when it becomes a little bit of an endurance or fear sets in, right? So that it affects everybody differently. I didn't ever quite have the fear, but it could be, hey, we win something, we're worth more. We lose something, we're worth less, right? Those are things that probably happen every day.
Right.
if you're set on selling, then do the best you can towards a sell, and that's where Todd's and others come in.
So I'm going to rapid fire a couple last questions. So do you think from a buyer, you're the buyer, is it easier for you to acquire a company with a banker in the middle? Does it facilitate that process and make it better, or does it make it more complicated and more difficult?
I think it's actually always better. And the reason is, unless you're a seller that has sold multiple times, right? An experienced seller might not need a broker buyer. A first-time seller, and I was a first-time seller, I was also a first-time buyer. There's tremendous benefit from having a professional in the middle. And the reason why is that professional can interpret data for you. They could give you context on market valuations. They could help you organize your data room, your book of business, your financials, your presentation, your story. Those have a lot of value, and if you haven't done those things before individually, the broker has, and the banker has, and so they could give you either they'll help you with those things, or they could give you very sound feedback on how those things
Right.
should.
And who did you use as your advisor?
On the buying side, nobody.
Right. We worked on that together. When you sold?
And when we sold, I used MoFo, so Morrison Forrester, as the legal counsel, and then I used Kips DeSantos as the kind of the broker. So
And
they
Kips
were the banker broker.
Yeah, and they're a pretty well-known and a very reputable banking firm that does a lot in the GovCon space. So here in DC. So last couple questions. If somebody is considering a process to do a transaction with their business, is there one or two little pieces of advice you would say, absolutely make sure you do this, or absolutely make sure you don't do that?
So the one, don't think that you can do it immediately, right? So the biggest piece is it's a job. So doesn't matter how squeaky clean all of your marketing materials are, your contracts materials are, your financials are, it still takes a lot of work to package it in a way that is going to be digestible by a buyer, right? So give yourself some time to organize all of that content.
Good.
And that usually takes 3 to 6 months. It could even take longer. It requires a team. Your accountants, your marketing department, sometimes your senior management, your employees. So and then that's a job. There's also running the company, which is also usually a full-time job. So there's going to be a period that just takes time, and you have to be prepared for that. It doesn't happen super, super fast.
How many guys?
Unless you have a buyer like VariQ, and they made it super easy, and we got to the finish line very quickly.
You were great to work with. What? How many guys on the inside? How many of your executive team did you tell about the sale, and how far in advance of actually closing did you tell them?
So there was about 5 individuals on VariQ's side that were involved. Our sale took about 18 months, so it was lengthy. Again, this was the middle of COVID, right? So there was a lot of things that happened during COVID. There was about 6 months where the buying community was just a little bit frozen. They didn't know what the markets would actually do. And so that took a little bit of time. There was also a couple busts in the middle, which means we were going in one direction, we had to pivot, move in another direction. So that happened a few times. But about 5 individuals knew what was going on, and there was about 2 of us that were heavily involved in the actual documentation, financial information. So very small team.
So you don't need to be sitting at that desk. Financially, you don't need to, but contractually, you don't need to. Yet here you are. Tell me a little bit about why that is.
Um, so so first of all, there's the age factor, right? So I'm in the I think middle age where the brain is still, you know, um, on steroids, right? So there's a lot of things constantly going on in the brain, and I like to be active. I'm not at that stage in life where I want a more relaxed type of existence. So what do? Right? You do what you love, you're good at. Part of it is also the integration with a much larger organization, making sure that goes smoothly. That we sold to a $18 billion organization, so part of the attractiveness in that is as a 50 million. We're very small compared to an 18 billion. How does an $18 billion company work? Were we attractive to them, right? So maybe there's a little bit of learning curiosity.
I'm sorry, I was going to ask, are you doing more of the same, or being part of that has opened up new windows for you?
So the role that I negotiated is completely different than what I'm currently doing.
By
So there's a
design.
little bit of, so I'd probably say 50% is, or maybe 30% of what I'm currently doing is about the same. I'm connecting customers, I'm connecting opportunities, I'm connecting deals. Another third currently is helping the teams integrate in their various capacities, right? Whether it's technology systems or business processes, making sure that employees have a smooth landing in the integrated organization, because I think that's a value. More like a facilitator, right? So I don't have any more direct reports, but I still find myself in a role of facilitator, which I enjoy. And then that will a little bit pivot into, well, let me learn a little bit about this big, huge organization. So that creates a little bit of intellectual curiosity,
Right.
and they're paying me. They're still paying me
So interesting,
really good.
because we've been able to do this for clients. When you have multiple offers, right, multiple interested parties, you become emboldened enough to say to a $18 billion firm like Capgemini, I will accept this deal, but I need this as my role going forward. Did that happen? And was that part of your ultimate decision on who to sell to?
Yes, every sophisticated buyer asked me, "What do you want to do?" Right?
Because they want
And
it to be a good fit, right? They don't want to lose you.
they
You're an asset.
they want me to be a good fit. When you have multiple offers, as a seller, you do have that ability to think about what it is that you want to do, whether it's walking away from the business, or whether it's staying in the business, or whether it's some other thing, right? You have the ability to think about what that role is or could be, and negotiate that. Either negotiate it into the deal, or at least have them articulate, this is the buyer, articulate their vision for you as an individual, right? If it's SIA, then they can tell you, we don't need you, and you have no interest in staying. That's great.
Yeah.
If it's, you've created this, maybe there's a lot of value, we'll figure out how to make you fit inside of the combined. Or if it's, nope, I want to now run this particular area of the business, if they want that, that comes as part of the package deal. For me, I have the flexibility to not have uh, a lot of responsibilities, which is great. So there's a little bit of time to roll into what that role is going to be. Conceptually, there's three areas. One, this $18 billion company bought a $3 billion company, so I will be involved in integrating that piece of the business. Two, there is a piece that is still strategy tied to the large organization that I will be able to fit into and be a part of. And three, they have a cybersecurity acquisition that was fairly significant that I will get to learn and then try to pull those experiences and capabilities back into GovCon.
I'm so glad we talked about that, because one of the things I always try to share with clients is that you can't see around the corner after a transaction, but it always opens up a lot of doors. Some you'll want to go through, some you'll want to pass on, some you'll want to make sure stay locked. But it really does open up in most cases, a bigger and brighter future. And so that, when we did the transaction with Rivet Logic, we had three really strong buyers. And Ali, at the end of the day, because it was mostly up to him because he stayed, really wanted to be a part of VariQ, mostly because of the environment that you had created. So it works, every time that there's a seller. If you have multiple interested parties, it allows you the opportunity to be honest with the buyer about what you want to do, which means you get a better fit, right? Mm-hmm. So great point that you made. Here's my last question to you. And we've known each other for a while, so I know that you are a very successful individual, business-wise, right? Also see the pictures around you, very successful family life and on member of the community, the whole thing. Is there something that you could point to, an experience, a mentor, a book that you read that you think has really contributed to your success long-term that you could share?
So I think I'll start with experience, right? So I'm the second oldest of 15 siblings, and I grew up overseas, right? So I came missionary kid. So my parents were Christian missionaries, and they traveled the world doing what the gospel told them is like, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. So they're like, okay, we're going to go to Iran. That was the first place they went. All right. They got kicked out of Iran and had the first child, my older brother. And then they went to Afghanistan, which is where I was going to be born. Instead, I was born in Italy. Then they went to Greece, then France. Then they eventually settled a little bit in Argentina, where I grew up mostly for 12 years. During those 12 years, the Argentine, so one, we had to, nobody sponsored how we were raised, right? We had to raise our own money. And that experience of knocking on doors, singing and passing the hat or getting donations to both survive and pay rent and all those things, I think those experiences as a kid were deeply ingrained. There was also economic unrest during those years. The peso changed over, hyperinflation, coups, where the tanks went into the streets. So there's lots of interesting experiences that I think were very valuable to how I just naturally
I think from an outsider.
Resilient. Yes.
Yeah. Resilient is one. Fearless was the word that came to my mind. Like a lot of entrepreneurs, I think yours you can directly trace back to that. But your fearlessness in how you approach Rivet Logic acquisition and how you approach your sale and how you approach growing the business, I think has resonated over and over again in your life. It feels like.
Yes. There's a confidence in. I think there's a history of confidence that even if you make significant mistakes, you will be able to jump back from those mistakes. Try not to make too significant of ones, right? So, but making mistakes is perfectly okay. And so the paralysis of second guessing yourself, that is one of the things that I think holds a lot of people back. The fear of the unknown is something that holds them back. So that fearlessness, you could call it confidence, is just something that creates speed and simplicity of thought and mind. And you don't have to be perfect in your thinking. You do have to have success in your outcomes. That creates confidence, and that's just built over a long period of time, right? But
and I gotta say, Ben, it's great when when one of the good guys, which are firmly in that camp, gets the kind of win that you have had. So I've enjoyed our friendship. I've really enjoyed you expressing yourself and sharing as openly as you have on this episode. So I will say thank you to that. And I will also say thank you to our good friends at TriVest for being our sponsor. And for all of our listeners, you can go and check out the Rivet Logic podcast and compare from buyer to seller. And Ben, thanks again. I really do appreciate you being on.
No, thanks, Todd. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the Second Bite podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.